I had been renting this small, cozy house for about 6 months, and although it wasn't much, it was perfect for me. As a graduate student, I needed a space where I could focus on my thesis without the distractions of crowded campus life or noisy roommates. The house was situated in a quiet neighborhood with a small backyard that bordered a tall wooden fence separating it from the parking lot of a nearby supermarket. I didn't mind the supermarket sounds, the occasional hum of cars driving by, the distant rattle of shopping carts. It was just enough noise to remind me that the world was still going on outside, but not so loud that it intruded on my peace. The quiet hum was comforting, like being in my own little bubble, far enough from the world to feel private but close enough to not be completely isolated. The house was exactly what I needed to focus on my studies. Most evenings, I would lose track of time while working late into the night on my thesis. I sat hunched over my laptop for hours, papers and coffee mugs scattered across the kitchen table. The only sound in the house was the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard as I typed out notes, wrote drafts, and tried to piece together my research. The silence was comforting, even productive. But that evening, something interrupted the quiet. The power went out. The sudden darkness was so abrupt that, for a brief moment, I thought I had blown a fuse or tripped a circuit. My laptop screen remained lit, casting a faint glow that illuminated my face and the immediate area around me, but the rest of the house completely dark. I sat there, still and confused, hoping that the power would come back on quickly, but the house remained unsettlingly silent. The usual hum of electricity, the buzz of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, everything was gone. The stillness in the house was different this time. It wasn't like any other power outage I'd experienced before. There were no storms, no heavy winds. Everything felt off. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and slowly stood up. The beam of light from the phone's flashlight swept across the dark walls, the shadows of furniture stretching across the room in an eerie dance. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the neighborhood bathed in darkness, but no. The streetlights outside were still glowing, so why was my house the only one without power? The circuit breaker was located in the basement, which meant I would have to go down there to check if the breaker had tripped. I had always disliked that basement. It was unfinished, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling, and the low, dark corners made it feel claustrophobic. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step seeming to groan with the history of the old house. The air grew noticeably colder as I moved deeper into the basement, sending a chill up my spine. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating the usual clutter of paint cans, old tools, and forgotten items. It was a typical basement except for what I saw next. As the beam of light hit the far corner, I froze. There, crouched low behind the old boiler, was a figure, completely still. My heart slammed in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't move. My mind raced, unable to process what I was seeing. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the light flickering across the figure's face. As the light hit his face, I saw wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his clothes were dark and ragged, blending into the shadows. His gaze was fixed on me with a chilling intensity, and I was paralyzed. The figure didn't move, not even a twitch, just those eyes staring at me, unblinking. Finally, my voice broke through the silence, barely a whisper. Who are you? I stammered, my heart pounding in my throat. The man didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, and then, in an instant, he moved. With an unnatural speed, he bolted from his crouched position and dashed around the boiler. The sudden movement startled me, and I stumbled backward. He sprinted for the back door. What I hadn't even realized was slightly ajar. His footsteps were heavy, echoing through the basement as he darted into the night. I was left standing there, frozen in place, flashlight shaking in my hand. For several long moments, I didn't know what to do. The reality of what had just happened hit me hard, and my legs finally gave way, moving only after a long pause. I rushed to slam the basement door shut, locking it with frantic hands. I leaned against the door, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm, collected voice only heightened my anxiety as I tried to explain what had just happened. "There's a man in my basement. He just ran out through the back door." I gasped. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way and instructed me to stay somewhere safe. Grabbing a heavy flashlight as a makeshift weapon, I sat in the living room, staring at the backyard. The seconds dragged on as I waited, every tiny sound causing my heart to race even faster. The flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car finally broke the silence, pulling into the driveway. A deep sigh of relief escaped my lips, though the terror still clung to me. One of the officers stayed with me by the door, offering reassurance, while the other headed down the creaky basement stairs. The sound of his boots echoed through the stillness of the house. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't long before his voice called out from the basement, "Got something!" Moments later, the officer re-emerged, holding a black duffel bag. The fabric was worn and dusty, and I could tell it had been hidden for some time. The officer looked at me and asked, "Do you recognize this?" I stared at the bag, shaking my head. "No, that's definitely not mine." He set the bag down and unzipped it. Inside, I saw a jumble of items. Electronics still in their boxes, wallets, and even some pieces of jewelry. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was looking at. "It looks like your basement's been used as a storage spot for stolen goods," the officer said, glancing over the contents, most likely stolen from the supermarket next door. The thought hit me hard. Someone had been using my home as a hiding place, and I hadn't noticed. The officer continued, "This is a common tactic for thieves. They stash stolen goods in places where they think they won't raise suspicion, private residences, abandoned buildings, etc. They come back later to collect them when things cool down, but your basement, that's bold." I could hardly process the implications. How long had this been going on? How many times had that man come into my house, hidden in the basement while I was unaware? The officers wrapped up their investigation, promising to keep an eye out for the thief and increase patrols in the area. But the reassurance felt empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that my space, my sanctuary, had been violated. My name is Kate, and I've always prided myself on being rational, grounded, and not easily shaken. I've never been one to jump at shadows or indulge in superstitions. I live a simple, quiet life in the suburbs, working as a freelance graphic designer from the comfort of my cozy little house. The house has always been my sanctuary, a place where I can unwind and escape the chaos of the world. I share it with Cooper, my 4-year-old German Shepherd, who has been my loyal companion through thick and thin. Cooper isn't like other dogs. He's calm, steady, and prefers curling up by my side to chasing squirrels or barking at strangers. He's my protector, my friend, and most importantly, my constant reminder of the peace I've built around me. But that peace was shattered one stormy night, a night that changed the way I see fear forever. It was one of those relentless storms that seemed to consume the night. The rain lashed against the windows with a ferocity that made the glass shiver. The wind howled through the trees, twisting branches and tearing leaves from their moorings, while thunder rumbled so violently it felt as if the entire house was trembling. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over me, scrolling through my phone in an attempt to distract myself from the chaos outside. I was used to storms like these. They were loud, yes, but ultimately harmless, or so I thought. Cooper lay on the floor at my feet, his usual spot during evenings like these. He had always been calm during storms, unfazed by the noise or the flashes of lightning, but tonight was different. As the storm continued to rage, I noticed Cooper wasn't lying down anymore. He was standing completely still by the basement door. At first I thought he was just restless, maybe uneasy from the thunder, but then I saw his posture. His body was stiff, his tail tucked tightly between his legs, and his ears were pressed flat against his head. His entire frame radiated tension, and I could hear the low guttural growl rumbling in his throat. "Cooper," I called softly, my voice hesitant. I had never seen him like this before. He didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes were locked on the basement door, his growl unwavering. Cooper's low growl grew louder as I moved closer to him. His body remained stiff, his ears pressed back, and his eyes never wavered from the basement door. His intensity made my chest tighten. "Cooper, it's okay," I said softly, crouching beside him. My hand reached out to stroke his fur, but his posture didn't relax. Instead, the growl turned sharper, deeper, and then he barked. The sound jolted me. Cooper rarely barked. It wasn't just the volume, it was the tone. This wasn't a playful or alert bark, it was urgent, commanding, almost frantic. It was like he was trying to warn me of something beyond my comprehension. My own unease began to surface. I glanced at the basement door, then back at Cooper. The way he pressed himself against my leg, his claws gripping the floor, only made the moment feel more surreal. I tried to steady myself to calm both him and me. "It's just the storm," I murmured, almost as if trying to convince myself. But as I looked at the door, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. A faint, warm glow was seeping out from beneath it. The basement light was on. For a moment I froze, replaying the day in my mind. I couldn't remember the last time I had gone down to the basement, let alone turned on the light. That door was always shut, the space below rarely used. The logical side of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd left it on, maybe I'd forgotten. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread. The glow under the door seemed to grow brighter as I stared at it. It shouldn't have been on. I stood up slowly, trying to suppress the icy knot forming in my stomach. I couldn't ignore it now. Even Cooper, normally so composed, seemed to sense something was wrong. His growls continued, his focus never shifting from the door. I hesitated. It was just a light. It had to be. "Come on, Kate," I whispered to myself, trying to summon courage. It's probably nothing. But my own voice felt hollow, lacking conviction. Standing before the basement door, I couldn't shake the weight of unease. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitant to touch the cold metal. Cooper's growl intensified, deep and guttural, vibrating through the air. He was practically glued to my side, his rigid body language screaming at me not to proceed. My fingers brushed the knob, and its icy chill sent a shiver up my spine. For a brief moment, I considered stepping away. The logical part of me begged to leave the door shut, to pretend nothing was happening. But curiosity, fear, and a gnawing sense of responsibility pushed me forward. "It's just a storm," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling as I tightened my grip on the knob. Cooper let out a sharp bark, startling me and causing my hand to jerk. Despite his protests, I turned the knob slowly, the mechanism clicking loudly in the stillness. My breath hitched as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit stairwell descending into darkness. The basement door groaned on its hinges, the sound unnervingly loud against the backdrop of the storm outside. A rush of cold air swept up from below, carrying a pungent scent, damp, stale, and something else I couldn't quite place. The faint glow of the basement light barely reached the top of the stairs, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. My heart raced as I peered into the gloom, unable to see beyond the first few steps. Cooper whined, pressing against my leg, his eyes locked on the stairs. His ears were pinned back and his growls had turned to sharp, nervous whimpers. Whatever was down there, he wanted no part of it. For a long moment I stood frozen, my hand gripping the doorframe as I debated what to do next. Then I heard it, a soft creak like someone shifting their weight on the wooden steps. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling as it echoed into the void below. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the pattering of rain against the house. Then faint and almost imperceptible, I heard it, breathing. It was slow and deliberate, like someone trying to remain quiet but unable to mask the sound completely. My blood ran cold. The breath wasn't mine. It wasn't Cooper's. It was coming from somewhere down in the basement. Is someone down there? I called again, louder this time, though my voice cracked with fear. The breathing stopped. The oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to shut the door and walk away, but I couldn't. Something primal kept me rooted in place, my ears straining for any hint of movement. As I stood at the top of the basement stairs, gripping the doorframe, the weight of the silence pressed down on me. My eyes strained to see past the flickering light that barely reached into the basement's depths. The damp smell was suffocating now, heavy with an undercurrent of something metallic and sour. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just paranoia. Something was wrong. I could sense it in the stillness, in the way the air seemed heavier than usual. Then I heard it again, the sound of breathing. It was faint, deliberate, and unmistakable. Each exhale seemed to echo off the walls, louder in the oppressive quiet. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, straining to pinpoint the source. The breathing stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and Cooper's low, nervous growls. My mind raced. Was it an animal, a trick of the storm, or was someone hiding down there? I couldn't retreat now, though every fiber of my being wanted to. There was something or someone below, and I needed to know what it was. I backed away from the open door, my hands trembling as I moved toward the kitchen. Cooper stayed close, his growls steady and low, his eyes never leaving the basement stairs. He seemed as uneasy as I felt, and his tension only heightened my own. In the kitchen, I rummaged through a drawer, my fingers fumbling as I searched for the flashlight. When I finally found it, the cold metal felt reassuring in my hand. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dimness with a sharp glow. I stood at the top of the stairs again, flashlight in one hand, gripping the banister with the other. My heart raced as I pointed the beam downward, watching the shadows dance and stretch across the basement walls. The flashlight felt like my only defense, its light barely strong enough to dispel the darkness below. Taking a deep breath, I prepared myself to descend. The first step creaked loudly under my weight, the sound echoing through the basement like a warning. The beam of the flashlight wavered as my hand trembled, casting jittery shadows across the walls. Cooper followed reluctantly, his body tense and his growls steady. Each step felt heavier than the last as I descended, the air growing colder and the oppressive silence closing in around me. The basement was as I remembered it, cramped, cluttered, and dimly lit. Old boxes were stacked haphazardly in one corner, alongside shelves lined with tools and forgotten trinkets. The laundry machines loomed like silent sentinels near the far wall, but something felt wrong. The space felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. My flashlight's beam swept across the room, illuminating each shadowy corner, but nothing seemed out of place. Then Cooper barked, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence. He bolted toward the far corner of the basement, his barking growing louder and more frantic with each step. My flashlight followed Cooper's movements, the beam finally landing on the object of his fury, a crumpled blanket lying behind the water heater. The sight stopped me in my tracks. I didn't recognize the blanket. It was dirty and damp, its once bright colors now muted and stained. It wasn't something I had left down here. Cooper was barking incessantly, his body rigid as he stood just a few feet from the blanket. His sharp growls filled the space, echoing off the walls and heightening my fear. I stepped closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand. As the beam illuminated the blanket fully, my stomach churned. Beneath the water heater, partially obscured by the fabric, was what looked like a makeshift bed. Then I saw them, muddy footprints trailing from the blanket toward the stairs. My breath hitched as I followed the trail of footprints with the flashlight. They were large and unmistakably human, the mud still fresh and glistening under the beam of light. The prints led directly to the stairs, the very stairs I had just descended. My mind raced as the realization sank in. Someone had been here. Someone had been walking around while I was upstairs, unaware. I swallowed hard, the cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Cooper's barking became more frantic, his growls turning into sharp, angry snaps. He moved closer to the blanket, pawing at the floor as if trying to unearth a hidden threat. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could move, the silence was shattered by a sudden noise, movement, loud and unmistakable, from behind me. The sound of footsteps thundered up the stairs, heavy and fast, each step echoing with urgency. I spun around, flashlight clutched tightly, but before I could react, something lunged at me from the shadows. The impact knocked me off my feet, sending the flashlight skittering across the floor. I hit the ground hard, the cold concrete jarring my spine. My vision blurred as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. A figure loomed over me, large, wild-eyed, and soaked to the bone, his face twisted with desperation. The man was strong, his movements frantic and erratic. He pinned me to the floor, his weight pressing down on me as I fought to free myself. My heart raced, panic surging through me as I clawed and kicked, trying to break his grip. Then Cooper sprang into action. With a ferocious bark, he lunged at the man, sinking his teeth into his leg. The intruder cried out in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to wriggle free. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline propelling me up the stairs. Cooper was right behind me, snapping and barking at the man as I reached the top and slammed the basement door shut. I didn't stop running until I was outside, pounding on my neighbor's door and screaming for help. When the police arrived, they found the man still hiding in the basement. Evidence of his stay, a backpack, food wrappers, and the crumpled blanket, confirmed he had been there for hours, waiting for the storm to mask his movements. Even now, the memory of his desperate eyes and the sound of his footsteps haunts me. Every time Cooper growls at something unseen, my heart skips a beat, wondering if danger is lurking once again. Story 3. For months, I had been expecting my car to break down. It was an old sedan, a model from the mid-90s, and I'd squeezed every last bit of life out of it. The engine was shaky, the body had seen better days, and the ride was anything but smooth. I knew it was only a matter of time before it gave out on me. I had every intention of replacing it, but life, work, bills, and a constant string of unexpected expenses kept getting in the way. Each time I thought I might finally be able to afford a new car, something else came up. So, I kept pushing it off, hoping the car would hold on a little longer, but deep down, I knew the end was coming. It had been a long shift at work, and as I drove home, the thought of replacing the car seemed more urgent with every mile. The odometer kept ticking up, and I could feel the car's struggle with each turn of the wheel. Every bump and groan made it clear I was gambling with my ride. But I kept pushing forward, hoping to make it home one last time before it finally gave out on me. As if the universe was in on the joke, the weather decided to add to the misery. The storm had been brewing for hours, but by the time I was halfway home, it had turned into a full-blown downpour. The rain came down in sheets, as though the sky had opened up and was dumping buckets on everything below. My wipers were at full speed, but they could barely keep up with the downpour. It was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. The road ahead was nothing but a blurry mess of water, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. The wind howled, pushing the car from side to side as if trying to steer me off course. The trees lining the road bent under the weight of the gusts, their limbs swaying like dark, threatening shadows. It felt like I was in a bubble, trapped in a tiny world where the storm was the only thing that mattered. There was no escaping the rain, the wind, or the overwhelming sense that something was off. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. The car gave a violent cough, and for a split second, I thought it might stall. I glanced at the dashboard, but there were no warning lights. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and the car started losing power. I pressed the gas, hoping for a miracle, but it was no use. There was only a sickly hum as the engine gave up completely. "Not now," I muttered under my breath, as if I could will the car to start again. The car lurched forward for a second, then slowed, eventually rolling to a complete stop. The engine gave a final, pitiful sputter, and then it went silent. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a dead car and no way to get home. I sat there for a few moments, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was hammering in my chest. It was one of those surreal moments when you think, this can't be happening right now. I pressed my palm to the steering wheel, half hoping the car would magically spring to life, but I knew it wouldn't. The rain kept pounding against the roof and steam was curling up from under the hood, making everything feel even more ominous. The darkness outside felt suffocating, as if I were completely alone in a world that had stopped moving. The storm was relentless, but it was the silence of the car, the dead engine, that felt worse than anything else. I took a deep breath and reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment, grabbing my jacket as I prepared to face the storm. I didn't want to leave the car, but I knew I had no choice. The storm was brutal. The wind slammed into me like a wall of cold, and within seconds I was drenched. My jacket didn't do much to shield me from the onslaught. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to make out what had gone wrong under the hood. I wasn't a mechanic, and I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A snapped hose, loose wires, anything that could explain why the car had suddenly quit on me. But as I crouched by the engine, something strange happened. The sounds of the storm, the wind howling, the rain pounding suddenly started to fade. Everything went eerily still for a heartbeat. The world seemed to stop, and I felt an odd sense of quiet that didn't belong in the chaos of the storm. The silence crept in so slowly that I didn't notice it at first, but then I realized something was wrong. A low crunch broke through the silence, and at first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks. The sound was like someone stepping on wet gravel, but it came again, closer this time. My heartbeat quickened. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand, cutting weak arcs through the rain, but there was nothing. The darkness was thick and the storm blurred everything beyond the small circle of light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely rising above the noise of the wind. There was no response. No sound of movement, nothing to indicate anyone was out there. My voice trembled with uncertainty, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably an animal seeking shelter from the storm raccoon, maybe, or just a trick of the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I stood there trying to rationalize the situation, I suddenly felt it, a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. It wasn't just the cold from the rain or the wind, it was something else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the air around me seemed to thicken, as if I was being watched. A heavy weight pressed down on me, and I couldn't explain it, but every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car. The feeling was suffocating. I didn't want to look around. I didn't want to admit that something was out there, but the fear crept in deeper. Every fiber of my being told me to run, to lock the doors, and never look back. The engine spluttered, then roared with unexpected force as the man's hands moved quickly, confidently, like he knew exactly what to do. Before I could even process the situation, he slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires spinning as it kicked up water and mud, screeching against the wet pavement. The car shot into the night, disappearing into the storm, leaving me standing there breathless and trembling in the downpour. Story 4. My name is Claire, and I've always found comfort in the little things, simple joys that help me decompress from the chaos of the day. A steaming cup of tea, a cozy blanket, and an old crime documentary were my staples for a peaceful evening. That night was no different. The house was quiet, the kind of serene quiet that felt soothing at first, but eventually started to feel too still. Outside, the wind began to pick up. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but it didn't prepare me for what was coming. The storm hit suddenly, a booming thunderclap announcing its arrival. Rain lashed against the windows with a ferocity I hadn't expected, and the wind howled like a wild animal. The lights flickered twice, the bulbs dimming into an unsettling weak glow. I knew the power would go out. It was just a matter of time. I tried to focus on the TV, ignoring the unease that had started to bubble in my chest, but something about the storm didn't feel right. The storm had taken over the house, its relentless battering against the walls drowning out everything else. I curled deeper into the couch, trying to get absorbed in the documentary, but a strange noise broke my concentration. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but distinct enough to catch my attention, a sound from upstairs. At first I thought it might be the house settling, an old structure groaning under the weight of the storm, but then I heard it again. A faint, deliberate rustling, like a window being shifted. I froze. My rational mind told me it was probably the wind, but my gut told me something was wrong. I paused the TV, sitting perfectly still, straining to hear more. Silence followed, broken only by the storm raging outside. I told myself it was nothing, just the weather playing tricks on me. Even so, a sense of unease lingered, making it impossible to focus. To calm my nerves, I decided to check the house. I started with the locks, moving to the front door first. It was secure. Then, the back door, also locked. I peeked out through the curtain into the backyard. The yard was pitch black, the rain turning the grass into a sodden mess. The fence swayed slightly in the wind, and the occasional flash of lightning cast sharp, eerie shadows. The storm felt alive, like it was watching me. I shook my head, trying to push aside the irrational thoughts. It was just my imagination, amplified by the chaos outside. I returned to the couch, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. No sooner had I pressed play than the sound returned, louder this time. A distinct, deliberate noise. Someone was messing with the window upstairs. My heart pounded as I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy metal flashlight. Its weight was reassuring in my trembling hands as I crept toward the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, the creaking of the wood beneath my feet amplified in the otherwise suffocating silence. The storm outside seemed distant now, as though I'd entered a vacuum where only my shallow breaths and the hammering of my pulse existed. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly illuminated by the faint glow of my bedroom nightlight. I could feel something was wrong. Then, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a window sliding open, faint but deliberate, coming from the guest room at the end of the hall. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, just a crack. My flashlight beam quivered as I hesitated. My heart screamed for me to turn around, but my feet carried me forward. I pushed the door open with my flashlight and stepped inside. The room was empty, but my gaze immediately fell on the window. It was open, just an inch or two, rain spattering onto the sill. My stomach turned as I realized what that meant. Someone had been here, someone had opened it. With trembling hands, I slammed the window shut and locked it. My pulse raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. That's when I noticed the floor. Wet footprints, barefoot, traced a path across the carpet, leading away from the window and out into the hallway. The sight of those footprints sent a jolt of cold fear through me. Someone wasn't just outside, they were already inside. I followed the tracks with my eyes, watching them disappear into the hallway. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight as I moved cautiously, one step at a time. I checked the bathroom first, empty, then my bedroom, also empty. The footprints continued, leading farther down the hall toward the staircase. The house felt wrong, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the dark hallway in a brief blinding burst. That's when I saw him. A man stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring up at me. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his face, water dripping from his clothes, his eyes locked on mine, cold and unreadable. In his hand, he held a crowbar for a moment. Neither of us moved. The storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the deafening silence between us. Then, without warning, he took a step forward. Panic overtook me. I swung the flashlight toward him, but the blow missed, smashing against the wall. The man lunged, the crowbar raised. I barely dodged, stumbling backward into the hallway. My mind raced, but my body moved on instinct. I scrambled into my bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it. With trembling hands, I shoved the dresser against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. My entire body was shaking, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Outside the door, I heard him try the handle, then slam his weight against it. My heart pounded as I gripped the flashlight, waiting for the door to give. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the silence. Finally, I forced myself to move. My phone, the only way to call for help, was downstairs on the couch. I crept out of the bedroom, every shadow in the hallway sending a jolt of fear through me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I descended the staircase, step by agonizing step. When I reached the living room, I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. Somehow, I managed to explain the situation to the operator, though my words were jumbled and frantic. The sirens were faint at first, but they grew louder, piercing through the storm. Red and blue lights flashed outside as the police arrived. They found the back door pried open and the wet footprints leading out into the backyard. But the man was gone. They searched the area for hours but found no trace of him. The detectives theorized it was a break-in gone wrong, but their explanations felt empty. The man hadn't taken anything, he'd just disappeared. Now, every time there's a storm, I can't help but relive that night. The sound of the rain, the flicker of the lights, it all brings me back to the moment I saw him at the bottom of the stairs. And I can't help but wonder if he'll ever come back.